Chapter 27. The Witch's Library. The company progressed ploddingly up the winding and haphazard staircases of the tower. Caleb could not stop himself from scanning the titles that they passed, and with regularity he would let loose an exclamation of delight and pause to pick up a book. Kendra, for her own part, could not blame him. There was simply so much to see, and so much of it extraordinary, until her own pace slowed to a crawl as well. One stately little courtyard was lined with interlocking globes of blown glass, housing strange, shadowy fishes that wove around the shelves of books. The next was full of all manner of timekeeping devices, some familiar and some more mysterious, with the crowning jewel certainly being the many-handed mechanical behemoth of silver that was set into the floor. It lay beneath a thick layer of what looked like glass, but echoed resonantly with each step. And a third alcove might have been an ordinary sewing room, if richly supplied and filled to the brim with parcels and manuals. Their journey was by and large well lit. A steady beam of sunshine seemed to pass straight down the great shaft, regardless of how the sun must have been moving outside. But most floors seemed to have their own native light sources as well. Some were lit by cozy hearths or elegant candelabras, while others were inlaid with a peculiar glowing stone. One room was full of spheres of light that hung from the ceiling and emitted a constant musical hum. One dark and cavernous nook even caught Boris and Maya's interest, with what Kendra recognized as the luminous mushrooms of the Black House sprouting up at measured intervals as both lanterns to read by as well as stumpy chairs. She even hid a little smile as an irreverent thought about toadstools and Boris's great bald head crossed her mind. It was a straightforward enough path, even climbing ever up along the unnerving edge of the abyss from platform to platform. Kendra was almost beginning to feel confident, when, abruptly and unceremoniously, they came to a dead end. There was an uncomfortable silence and many a furrowed brow, excepting Adrian. He maintained his usual demeanor, looking around with an unhurried vigilance, even as he huddled close to Kendra. Eventually, she broke the silence, clearing her throat. "Well, this seems like a bit of a problem. I figured being in a library and all, I'd be in my element. It's just my luck that this is the only library in the world that seems to demand climbing cliffs. Does anyone else see another way up?" It had been getting easier to talk again, even if the glibness came a little forced. Caleb gave her a look, but let it pass. Then, with an alarming flourish, he tossed himself over the railing, hanging nimble as a squirrel as he surveyed the walls around them. Kendra thought she might have heard Maya mutter, "Show off," but it was hard to be sure. After a few moments, he frowned and shook his head. "There's more stairs above us, but it looks like it skips almost 10 stories," he said perplexedly. "I don't see anything around us that suggests any other way up." Deep into the little hall, Boris was knocking on the walls, his ear pressed directly to the stone. Eventually he nodded and turned back to them. "There's passages all around us," he said gruffly, "and judging by how they echo, they go around a long way. Maybe even all the way up to those next platforms Mr. Caleb saw. But I can't see how we'd get into them." Maya sighed impatiently and began to knock and listen as well. But in short order she too gave an irate shrug. "I suppose he's right. I can't feel any opening to those corridors anywhere near us," she admitted, carefully directing her words past Boris. Kendra raised her eyebrow, but thought better of it. Well, everybody spread out and take a look around, she suggested. Maybe there's something in this room that can clue us in. The four of them began to sift carefully through the area. It was unremarkable, not unlike the other little study halls they had passed through. The theme of the room appeared to be old Valerian, and the subjects of the books on the shelves confirmed as much. Or at least, they did when she could read their titles. Many appeared to be in the original tongue, a language nearly 500 years dead. The architectural flourishes matched the subject matter, full of clean marble columns and ornate engravings. Against one wall, an antique suit of armor stood on a pedestal, a signature wide-bladed Valerian sword set into its grasp, and a nearby shelf bore a large green banner in a place of honor, a golden eagle emblazoned fierce and majestic across it. It was a treasure trove, equaling any showing of a great museum in the capital, but there was nothing that hinted at a way forward. After a time, Kendra halted, taking a step back and watching intently. It made no sense. There had to be a way. Medusa had said she'd had an audience with the sisters. She turned to Adrian, where he was sitting at the edge of the terrace, peeking through the rungs of the railing. "Any ideas on a way up?" she asked, not especially hopeful. He had never been the loquacious type. He thought for a moment, before gesturing over the abyss to the far side. "Right," she said warily. It was, of course, an easy enough problem to solve if you could fly, but Adrian still looked pale and spent. She doubted that he could have gotten himself up there, let alone the rest of them. Maybe the answer was in one of the books, but there were hundreds of volumes around them, and even then it might be written in bloody old Valerian. She was staring unfocused about the room, nibbling absently at a nail and working through the problem, when something occurred to her. She knew that suit of armor. She had thought it was simply something she had studied in her history lessons, years ago now, but it was clearer than that, more recent. The delicate inlay of leaves on the breastplate, the plumage of the helmet. She'd seen this armor before. The others turned as she gasped, but for a time she did not reply as she dug furiously through her bag. With a cry of triumph, she pulled forth the book from the living city and began to leaf carefully through. It was there. In the corner of a page, there was a small, intricate sketch of this armor. Most of the page concerned an incongruous mechanism of cogs and wheels, its purpose not clearly indicated. Caleb continued to ask questions, but after several moments of Kendra's silence, Boris nodded and steered the elf away to a far corner of the room. The function of the machine was utterly beyond her. She had studied some such things in passing, but never in such detail, and she suspected that this diagram was beyond even the greatest of modern mundane smiths. But somehow, as she stared, Kendra felt a growing feeling of familiarity. It was not an understanding that she could have put into words, but something about it felt right. Eventually, still squinting, she rose and crossed the room to where the suit of armor stood. She felt around at the base of the pedestal and was not entirely surprised when she felt a delicate switch. She pushed it and heard an audible click. With scarcely a rustle, the wall behind the displayed armor began to slide into the ground. So fine was the laying of the stones that even now, as the segment of the trick wall passed by the true wall on either side, she could not see the hinge. "I'll be damned," muttered Maya. "I couldn't feel the cracks at all. They're hardly there. You found that in your book? Might be there's something to that thing after all. Kendra?" Kendra was not entirely listening. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her chest felt tight. Maya's voice seemed oddly muffled, and there was a ringing in her ears. She watched as the opening formed, unveiling the space beyond. It was a long stone tunnel that ran up a steep slope into deepening darkness, and she had the terrible sensation of falling up into it, a sucking maw waiting eager to swallow her. For a moment she was certain that she saw a shape in the shadows, a shock of red hair and that mockery of a grin. The tunnel was gone, and Kendra started. Maya had stepped in front of her, blocking it from sight. She extended her hand to Kendra gently, and after a shaky breath, Kendra took it and squeezed. "Caleb," Maya said in a deliberately relaxed voice, "could you make a torch?" "Why?" Caleb asked, confused. "We have 2 stalwart dwarves in the lead. Lightless conditions shouldn't pose any difficulty for us." "Just do it, please," Maya said, calm but insistent. All the while, she kept her attention on Kendra. "Just breathe," she murmured, her voice only for Kendra. Behind them, Caleb grunted his unwilling acceptance. "You have to explain to the sister why I was breaking things in her tower, though," he shot back, a loud crack of wood accompanying the statement. As Caleb readied the implement, slowly the trembling died away. Kendra looked away from Maya, shame stinging at her eyes. "Sorry," she mumbled. "A fine time for me to be going to pieces." Maya shrugged it off with a smile that made her look almost like her old self. "It's fine," she said simply. "I get it. We've all been through a lot, so for now we'll just take the time we need and do the best we can. You lean on me and I'll lean on you, and I reckon we'll do just fine." A rush of gratitude swelled in Kendra, but she knew if she tried to speak, she'd start crying again. So she nodded her head. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw Boris wearing the most curious expression. It was something wistful, proud, and tender, but as she raised her head, it was gone in a flash. "Here you go," said Caleb. His voice was friendly, but she jumped nonetheless. She'd not heard him approach, and the flames burned hungry and near. For several moments she fought down the urge to shy away, until with a deep breath she unfurled her tensely coiled muscles and assumed a fair approximation of a smile. "Get a grip," Kendra hissed to herself. "Thank you," she said aloud. Could you hang on to that, for now?" "Scared of the fire and scared of the dark," she thought scathingly. "Where does that leave you?" But mercifully, Caleb asked no questions, nodding agreeably. With a little bow that was not exactly respectful, but also not entirely ironic, he gestured for Maya to lead the way. Then he beckoned Kendra on. "Stay close," he said, and his smile had enough genuine warmth that she was able to take that first step into the cold blackness. The shadows closed in, but they were not as tight as they had been before under the hill. Maya walked at the head of the column, sensing their way forward with pursed lips and furrowed brow. Behind her, Caleb held the torch aloft, occasionally shooting furtive glances back at her. Kendra walked in the middle, consulting her book by the flickering light, and trying not to look into the long passageways that spiraled away into utter darkness. Adrian never left her side, steady and attentive, his head bobbing around with that casual watchfulness. And at the rear, Boris followed close behind, uncharacteristically silent in his vigilance. The tunnels were smooth and had the same perfect craftsmanship as everything else in the citadel, but they were also painfully complex. Many paths branched off, curving away like serpents in every direction. For all her skill in feeling the shape of the earth, Maya often seemed uncertain as she picked her route, and the relevant text in the journal spread out over many pages, details and diagrams disconnected or overburdened with theory and calculations. Kendra was feeling quite lost when they came abruptly to a dead end. Caleb tapped his foot impatiently, and Maya growled in frustration. But Kendra found herself strangely absorbed by the round little room. It was not so barren as many of the winding passages had been. It had the look of an ancient shrine, with a small open space surrounded on 3 sides by statues of 3 stately women. The one on the left was bespectacled and burly, clothed in what seemed to be simple workman's garb. Her hair was tucked in a neat bun, and her mouth was a severe line. The rightmost one was smaller. Her plump figure and ample bust fitted well to a simple and understated gown. Her hair was a wild and bushy mess, and she seemed to be smiling unknowably at Kendra, regardless of where she stood in the room. Beside them, the third was rather stark. Though still clearly feminine, this last figure was almost featureless, with a lean dancer's body in unadorned robes, a shaved scalp, and a blank mask over her face. "Who are they?" Kendra asked distantly. She had an uncanny sense of familiarity. "Are these the sisters?" She stepped in close, examining each in turn. Caleb cast another look around the room before shrugging disinterestedly. "I doubt it. Very few people alive today have actually met the sisters face to face, but it is quite unusual for such depictions to not include iconography of the familiars, the hare and the raven. And regardless, there are only 2 witches of the garden." She nodded thoughtfully, flipping through the pages of the book. There had been something about this. She was sure that she'd just seen it. There! Rendered in immaculate detail was a drawing of the 3 women. "I knew I'd seen it before," she muttered. "It stuck out to me because there's almost nothing written here. Everything else in the book has a dense technical description, but this just indicates roughly where it's located." "And where is that, exactly?" Maya asked, a patient grin spreading over her lips. "Oh, right," Kendra said, blushing. I think we took a wrong turn at that last left. We were supposed to keep going straight." The company nodded their acknowledgement and made to head back. It had not been the first such wrong turn they'd made, but somehow this one caught at her. The tunnels had been nearly featureless up until now, and there had never been a dead end before. But as far as she could tell, it really was nothing more than it seemed to be. Her guidebook did not indicate any hidden switches or levers, no special significance. "Do you know anything about this place?" she asked Adrian curiously. He had been standing quietly at the back of the room, his gaze resting on the leftmost statue, the serious workwoman. He gave her and Kendra a wistful smile and said, "Friends."
"Miss Kendra, I don't think we'll find anything else by standing around here with our jaws hanging open."
She started and looked up to see Boris, who was beckoning to her with a fond glower. The light of the torch was already bouncing around a corner up ahead. Hastily, she grabbed Adrian's hand and ran to catch up, ignoring the old dwarf's deep, resonant chuckles. The passages looped round and round, deeply disorienting, but Kendra was sure that they were making upwards progress. It was a good thing, too. The flames of the torch were beginning to gutter out. She could only assume that they must have been going for several hours by then. The idea of an end just out of sight helped her breathe more easily, and staved off thoughts of wandering alone in the dark and the sharp things that lurked unseen. She felt a bead of perspiration rolling from her brow and squeezed Adrian's hand tightly. Kendra had been watching the last licks of flame on the torch with such anxiety and attentiveness that she had not noticed the slope begin to even out, the passage straightening. Her breath was coming shallow and quick again when she heard Maya thump her chest with a gloating "Ha!" Kendra's head shot up, and for a moment she had to fight down tears of relief. Just beyond the next corner, a glimmer of light bounced enticingly from the wall. "Come on!" she cried, jogging hastily towards the exit, shoulders sagging as if a great weight had been lifted from them. She was altogether quite distracted, and doubtless that was the intention, for Kendra did not notice what was going to happen next until it was already in motion. Above them there was a great whirring and humming, and a sound of metal on metal. Maya and Boris felt it first, and had just enough time to call out and begin to run forward protectively, knocking Kendra out of the way. Just as they did, the tunnel began to ring thunderously with what sounded like 100 hammers pounding in unison as spindly legs began to descend upon the dwarves. Kendra watched in stunned horror as they were ensnared in an instant by what looked in the half-light to be great mechanical spiders of burnished bronze. Caleb had not noticed as quickly, but when he did, his reflexes served him well. He slipped cat-like through the initial hail of crashing limbs until he was level with where Kendra and Adrian lay sprawled further down the tunnel. Roughly, he pulled them to their feet, his burning eyes brooking no argument. "Go!" he shouted, pushing them towards the mouth of the cavern so hard that they almost stumbled and fell again. Catching herself, Kendra took one last terrified glance back at Maya and Boris, but they had passed entirely out of sight behind a veil of clattering metal. Hating herself and the cowardice that shook her legs and knotted her guts, she grabbed Adrian's hand and began to sprint away, Caleb running furiously just behind. They very nearly made it. Other metal limbs began to drop down and block their way, but Caleb slammed into them with bestial ferocity, knocking them aside for the precious moment needed to let them pass. But there were simply too many of them. Caleb leapt to strike one out of their way, and a second caught him hard in the chest, staggering him. Kendra slowed to pull him on, but already more limbs were reaching out to entangle his thrashing form. She reached back, but with the last free movement left to him, he pushed her away. "Go!" he snarled again, before he was utterly swallowed by the mass of metal limbs. On the brink of panic, she obeyed. She was in the sunlight of the hollow core of the tower again before she could make herself look back. She was on another platform, a new section of the library, much the same as those that had come before the tunnels. But as she turned to the darkness of the passage, trying to control her trembling, she was surprised to see that the clamor had almost stopped. Nothing was chasing her and Adrian. Indeed, he seemed unconcerned by the entire situation. Something still clattered and clanked in that lightless space, but now it was orderly and rhythmic. Slowly, by inches, it stepped into the light. What emerged was something like a palanquin, though the passengers were most assuredly prisoners. An intricate lattice of bars held each of her friends in procession, like bird cages atop twitching masses of scuttling, crab-like legs. Kendra breathed a sigh of relief. They looked battered and alarmed, but not much the worse for wear. Caleb in particular hissed and seethed angrily at the confines of his cage, but his bearer seemed generally unperturbed by its captive's displeasure. "Are you all right?" Kendra called as they emerged, hardly daring to believe it. "We're fine," Maya said loudly, speaking over the clinking of the clawed metal feet and Caleb's steady flow of obscenities. "Can you see any way to release us?" Kendra looked around, but there was very little of use in the room, which seemed mostly concerned with refracting rainbows through an assortment of dazzling glass prisms. She tried to tug on a leg of one of the walking cages, but it was quick-moving and hard to get much leverage on. It seemed largely unaware of her, and indeed proceeded right past her and Adrian, beginning to march up the stairs. It appeared that the automatons had much the same intention as their party, and soon Kendra was jogging to keep up, as the many-legged beasts steadily ascended through the upper library platforms of the Citadel. "I'm sorry I didn't come back for you," Kendra panted. The automatons set a relentless pace, spiraling ever upwards. "I wanted to help, but I lost my head. I started to panic. I'm sorry." She was thoroughly miserable. Between the shame and the fatigue, she wanted to just curl up, but she dared not lose sight of them. She could do nothing for them, nothing at all. Boris looked rather uncomfortable. His cage was certainly a bit tight for him, and the path they took was less than smooth, jostling and tossing him constantly. Still, he managed to face her with a reassuring smile.
"Listen, Miss Kendra, I need you to keep your chin up now, because likely as not, we really will need your help soon enough. You got scared, and you ran and kept yourself safe. That's just good sense. And because of that, you're in the best position out of all of us to do something. So be ready to do what you can, and don't spend so much time wringing your hands about what you can't do. Because I'll be honest, that fussing and self-pitying doesn't help me one bit."
The words stung like a slap in the face, but all the while Boris's eyes were understanding. She found that she could feel the cold wind of the expanse on her face again, her mind clearing, and she nodded up to him. "I'm glad you're back," she said eventually. "No one quite kicks my butt when I need it like you do." In spite of his discomfort, he chuckled.
"Anytime, Miss Kendra. Anytime."
Abruptly, the strange caravan came to a stop. They had plateaued into a large open area, and the spindly metal monsters seemed quite content to sit. Now, with the cages stationary, surely there was something she could do. Immediately she stepped in close, examining the joints. They did not seem so strong in truth. That would surely be the first step, disabling them, so her friends could not be taken any further. Experimentally, she gave one a kick, rattling the entire apparatus and eliciting a loud, unpleasant creak, not unlike the croak of an enormous wounded bird. She grinned and prepared to continue. "I'll thank you not to do any further damage to my property, if you don't mind." Kendra froze. The voice came from behind her on the balcony, overlooking the abyss. But there'd been no one there when she'd come up just moments before, she was certain. Cautiously, Kendra turned to face the voice. At first, she could not believe her eyes. It was one of the women of the statues, the bespectacled severe woman. Her clothes were a little different, though still plain and utilitarian, and she could see now that the woman was dark-skinned and had shocking white hair tied in a tight bun. But the statue had clearly been ancient, while she was vital and hardy, of some indeterminate age. There was indeed nothing feeble about that piercing gaze. Kendra felt those eyes like the brush of a razor, precise and purposeful, and it was then that she became certain that Caleb had been wrong. Calling upon a courtesy she had learned at a young age in what felt now like another life, Kendra bowed formally and low, an address for a queen, dropping to a knee. "My apologies, lady," she said, and she was pleased that the old training kept her voice from shaking. "I meant no disrespect." She offered no further explanation, nor did she raise her head. "Did you not consider it disrespectful to enter another's home when you were not invited?" The question was flat and unreadable, and Kendra felt a cold sweat breaking out across her back. "I beg your forgiveness, lady," Kendra replied, and she could feel a burning at the back of her throat, a tremble creeping into her words. "Our lack of courtesy owes itself to our urgency, and not to any slight against you." "Your reasons are of little consequence. I cannot allow—" The clipped tone cut off abruptly. When she spoke again, it was in an entirely new voice, shocked and disbelieving. "Adrian!" Her eyes firmly glued to the ground, Kendra did not see what happened next. She heard the patter of feet, a small whump of impact, an inaudible exchange of murmuring. Finally, the woman spoke again. "Raise your head, girl." Kendra blinked. She had obeyed before she could even think. There was a force in the quiet command that made any other course of action unthinkable. She looked up, kneeling nervously as the woman inspected her clinically, a collector considering an unusual specimen. There seemed to be something in her survey she did not like, because the hard line of her mouth grew grimmer still. But Adrian stood close behind the woman now, his smile serene, and Kendra took heart. "I assume you know who I am." It was not really a question, and there was no doubt in Kendra's mind. She nodded. "Yes, Lady Genevieve." There was a sharp intake of breath behind Kendra, but the witch of words took no notice. She went on brusquely. "Good. You are very fortunate, girl. I have many questions for you, and so I am granting you an audience. Come with me, now." She turned away, not waiting to see if she had been obeyed, and Kendra found herself coming unquestioningly to her feet, already following. She swallowed hard and stopped. "My lady, about my friends—" The witch sister stopped halfway up the staircase and gave a brief, uninterested look back. "I have not told my cages to squeeze the life out of them, which is better treatment than intruders have any right to expect. If you are appropriately compliant, I may even pardon them. Currently, the best thing you can do for your friends would be to attempt to put me in a forgiving mood. Being made to repeat myself does not accomplish that. Come with me, now." Kendra flinched and looked back hurriedly to her friends. Caleb still had a frantic, trapped light in his eye, but for now he held himself steady, and Boris looked as unflappably impassive as ever. It was Maya, however, who caught her eye. She stared sightlessly at where Kendra stood, her face painfully intent. It was a message that could not have been plainer if she had shouted it. "It's all up to you now." Kendra's mind lingered on the rows upon rows of faceless dwarves in the black house under the hill, and the responsibility fell over her like cold rain. She would take this audience that Maya could not. she would not fail her friend. Swallowing, Kendra nodded once, and then ran up the staircase after the expectant witch.